The smell hit Deputy Marshal Thomas Whitmore first. Sweet decay mixed with something else something. It made his stomach turn and his hand instinctively reach for the handkerchief in his coat pocket. It was the morning of November 17th, 1853, and the autumn mist clung to the weathered shingles of the Callahan farmhouse, like fingers refusing to let go. As Whitmore climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, each step groaned under his weight, protesting as if the house itself didn't want him to continue. The smell grew stronger. Behind him, his partner Deputy Clark had stopped at the landing, covering his mouth, his face pale as morning frost. Asterisk, Sweet Mary and Joseph. Asterisk, Clark whispered, his voice barely audible, but it wasn't the smell that would haunt Thomas Whitmore for the rest of his days. It wasn't even the sight that greeted him when he pushed open that attic door. It was the sound. The complete, suffocating silence where there should have been something else. Where there should have been voices. When the door swung open, Whitmore's lantern cast dancing shadows across what he would later describe in his official report as a scene that defied all Christian understanding. 39 crude wooden cages lined the walls of the attic space, each one barely large enough for a child to curl up inside, each one bearing evidence of prolonged occupation. And each one ... empty. The question that would echo through the hills of Harlan County, Kentucky, for generations to come was simple, yet terrifying. Where were the children? And perhaps more disturbing still, what had the Callahan family been doing to them in that godforsaken attic? To understand the horror that unfolded in the Callahan attic, we must first journey back to the early days of Harlan County, when the mountains still held secrets that civilized folk weren't meant to uncover. The year was 1847 when Ezekiel Callahan first appeared in the remote hollers of southeastern Kentucky. A tall, gaunt man with eyes the color of winter sky, he claimed to be a traveling preacher from the mountains of West Virginia. He spoke of salvation and redemption, of gathering the lost children of God and showing them the true path to righteousness. Locals, God-fearing folk struggling to carve out a living from the unforgiving mountain soil, welcomed him with the cautious hospitality that mountain people reserved for strangers. Ezekiel had a way with words, they said. When he preached at the small Baptist church on Sundays, grown men wept and women fell to their knees in rapture. But it was his wife, Temperance, who truly unsettled people. Temperance Callahan was a woman of perhaps 30 years, though her exact age seemed to shift depending on the light. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice carried an odd cadence, as if she were speaking words in a language not quite her own. The women of the community noticed things about Temperance, how she never seemed to blink when spoken to, how her fingers were always stained with what looked like rust, how she would stare at their children with an intensity that made mothers pull their little ones closer. The Callahans purchased a plot of land on Bent Mountain, 6 miles from the nearest neighbor. The farmhouse they built was large by mountain standards, 3 stories, with a peculiarly high-peaked roof and windows that seemed to watch you as you passed by on the old logging road. It was in the spring of 1848 that the first children came. To stay with the Callahans, Ezekiel had approached several families in the county, speaking of his calling to care for orphaned and wayward children. He quoted scripture with the fervor of a true believer. Asterisk, suffer the little children to come unto me, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The Callahans, he claimed, had been blessed by God with the ability to reform even the most troubled. Young souls. In those days, life in the mountains was harsh. Families often had more children than they could feed, and accidents in the coal mines and logging camps left many little ones without fathers. When a well-spoken preacher offered to take in these children, to feed and clothe them and teach them the ways of the Lord, it seemed like an answer to many prayers. The first to go was 8-year-old Mary Hutchins, whose father had died in a mining collapse the previous winter. Her mother, Sarah, was struggling to feed her 3 remaining children on seamstress work that barely brought in enough to keep them alive. When Ezekiel Callahan offered to take Mary and give her a proper Christian education, Sarah Hutchins wept. With relief, others followed. The Murison twins, whose mother had died in childbirth. Little Jimmy Foster, who had been caught stealing bread from the general store. Susan and Rachel Webb, whose father had abandoned the family to seek his fortune. In California, by the end of 1848, 14 children had been taken in by the Callahans. The pattern was always the same. Ezekiel would approach struggling families with his offer of salvation for their children. He would quote scripture, speak of the Lord's plan, and promise that the children would be well cared for and properly educated. The families, often desperate and facing impossible choices, would tearfully hand over their little ones, and the children would disappear into the Callahan farmhouse on Bent Mountain. For the first few months, everything seemed normal enough. Ezekiel would bring some of the children to church on Sundays, where they sat in perfect silence throughout the service. They were always clean, always well-dressed, always perfectly behaved. When asked about their new life, they would simply nod and say they were learning to serve the Lord. But there were oddities that people began to notice. The children never seemed to gain weight, despite Ezekiel's claims that they were well fed. Their eyes held a strange, distant quality, as if they were looking at something no one else could see. They never played or laughed, never spoke unless spoken to directly. And they never, ever asked about their families back home. Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, the church organist, later told investigators that she had tried to engage young Mary Hutchins in conversation after a Sunday service in late 1849. I asked her if she missed her mother, Mrs. Briggs would testify. The child just stared at me with those hollow eyes and said, "Mother says we mustn't speak at the time before." The time before was darkness. Now we serve the light. The way she said it, it wasn't like hearing a child speak at all. It was like hearing words spoken through a child. As 1850 dawned, more children continued to arrive at the Callahan farm. The numbers grew, 18, 22, 28. Ezekiel claimed to be running a proper school now, preparing these lost souls for lives of Christian service. He spoke of sending them out as missionaries when they came of age, of placing them in good Christian homes as servants and workers. But the families who had given up their children began to grow restless. They asked when they might visit, when they might see how their little ones were faring. Ezekiel always had reasons why visits were impossible. The children were in a delicate stage of their education. They were being weaned from worldly attachments. Seeing their former families would only confuse them and set back their spiritual progress. It was in the summer of 1851 that things began to truly unravel. Mrs. Sarah Hutchins, Mary's mother, had remarried and found herself in better circumstances. She wanted her daughter back. When she approached Ezekiel with her request, he became agitated. Speaking of God's will and the dangers of removing a child from her spiritual education. When Mrs. Hutchins persisted, Ezekiel finally told her the truth that would send ice through the veins of every parent in Harlan County. Mary was gone, along with 6 other children. They had been sent, he claimed, to missionary families in distant states. He had no way to contact them, no way to bring them back. They belonged to the Lord now. But Sarah Hutchins was not a woman to be dismissed so easily. She began asking questions, talking to other families, piecing together a pattern that would ultimately lead to that terrible morning in November of 1853. Because Sarah Hutchins had discovered something that Ezekiel Callahan never expected anyone to discover. She had learned to count, and when she counted the children who had gone to the Callahan farm over the years, and then counted the children who had supposedly been sent away to missionary families, the numbers told a story that defied All explanation. 30-9 children had vanished into the Callahan farmhouse. And no one could account for where they had gone. Sarah Hutchins was not an educated woman by conventional standards, but she possessed something far more valuable than book learning, a mother's intuition and the stubborn determination that comes from loving someone who has been taken from you. In the autumn of 1851, Sarah began what would become a 2-year investigation that would eventually expose one of the most disturbing mysteries in Kentucky's history. She started simply with conversations at the general store, casual questions at church socials, quiet inquiries during quilting bees. Asterisk, have you heard from your little ones at the Callahan place? She would ask. The responses were always variations of the same theme. No, they hadn't heard. But Brother Ezekiel had explained that contact with former families would interfere with the children's spiritual development. The children were in God's hands now. They would write when their education was complete. But Sarah noticed something else in these conversations, something that made her blood run cold. When she pressed for details about what exactly Ezekiel had told them about their children's whereabouts, the stories began to change. Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, mother of the twins, had been told her boys were sent to a Baptist mission in Tennessee. Mr. Harold Foster believed his son, Jimmy, was working for a God-fearing farming family in Ohio. The Webbs thought their daughters had been placed with a preacher's family in Virginia. But when Sarah asked when these placements had supposedly occurred, she discovered something impossible. According to Ezekiel's stories, all of these children had been sent away during the same week in August of 1851. 7 children, to 7 different families in 7 different states, all dispatched within days of each other. Sarah began keeping a written record, though her spelling was uncertain and her handwriting rough. She documented every conversation, every date, every detail she could remember about what families had been told. The pattern that emerged was more disturbing than she had imagined. Not only were the children's supposed departures suspiciously coordinated, but the reasons given for their placement kept changing. When pressed for details months later, Ezekiel would tell different stories entirely. Jimmy Foster, who had supposedly gone to Ohio to work on a farm, was later said to be studying at a seminary in Pennsylvania. The Morrison twins, initially placed with a mission in Tennessee, were subsequently described as traveling with an evangelical family through the territories. It was as if Ezekiel Callahan was making up these stories as he went along, spinning an ever more complex web of lies to explain away the disappearance of 39 children. But the most disturbing discovery came when Sarah Hutchins finally worked up the courage to do something that would change everything. On a gray October morning in 1852, she decided to ride up to Bent Mountain and see the Callahan farm for herself. The ride up to the Callahan farm took Sarah the better part of 2 hours, following old logging roads that wound through dense forest and around steep mountain faces. The October air was sharp with the promise of an early winter, and the leaves rustled with a dry whisper that seemed to follow her up the mountainside. As she crested the final ridge and the Callahan farmhouse came into view, Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. The house was larger than she had imagined, its 3 stories rising against the mountain sky like something from a fever dream. The windows, too many of them, and placed at odd intervals, stared down at her with an intensity that made her want to turn her horse around and flee back down the mountain. But it wasn't the house itself that stopped her cold. It was the silence. This was supposedly a farm housing nearly 40 children and 2 adults. There should have been sounds, voices calling out, children playing, the normal bustle of daily life. Instead, the mountain air carried only the whisper of wind through bare trees and the distant call of a crow. Sarah dismounted and tied her horse to a fence post at the edge of the property. The closer she got to the house, the more details she noticed that made her skin crawl. The yard was too neat, too empty. There were no toys, no signs that children lived here, no laundry hanging on lines, no footprints in the dirt paths between. Buildings dot the barn, stood with its doors slightly open, revealing nothing but shadows within. The chicken coop was silent, no clucking, no rustling of feathers. Even the most well-maintained farm had sounds, smells, signs of life. This place felt ... hollow. Sarah approached the front porch, her boots making what seemed like impossibly loud sounds on the wooden steps. She had planned to knock on the door, to ask to see her daughter, to demand answers to the questions that had been eating at her for months. But when she reached the front door, she noticed something that made her freeze, scratches, long, deep scratches in the wood around the doorframe, as if made by fingernails. Dozens of them, overlapping and crisscrossing, creating a pattern that spoke of desperation. As if someone or many someones had clawed at this door, trying to get out. Before she could process this fully, the door suddenly swung open. Temperance. Callahan stood in the doorway, her pale eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made the mountain air seem to drop 10 degrees. She wore a dark dress that hung loose on her thin frame, and her hands, Sarah noticed, were stained with something dark that looked like old blood. Asterisk, you're not supposed to be here. Asterisk, Temperance said, her voice carrying that odd cadence that had always unsettled people. It wasn't quite an accent, wasn't quite a speech impediment. It was as if she were translating every word from some other language before speaking. Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. Asterisk, I've come to see my daughter. Mary Hutchins. Asterisk, Temperance's expression didn't change. She continued to stare with those pale, unblinking eyes. Asterisk, there is no Mary here. There never was a Mary here. Asterisk, the words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Asterisk, what do you mean? Brother Ezekiel took her 3 years ago. She's been living here. Asterisk, you're mistaken. Asterisk, Temperance replied, still in that unsettling monotone. Asterisk, we have no children by that name. We have never had children by that name. Asterisk, Sarah's mind reeled. This was impossible. She had seen Mary herself, sitting in church with the other Callahan children. She had spoken to her, touched her face, kissed her goodbye the day Ezekiel had taken her. Asterisk, where is Brother Ezekiel? Sarah managed to ask. Asterisk, I need to speak with him. Asterisk, Brother Ezekiel is about the Lord's work. Asterisk, Temperance said. Asterisk, he cannot be disturbed. Asterisk, and then, without another word, Temperance Callahan stepped back into the house and closed the door. Sarah heard the distinct sound of multiple locks being turned. One after another. Sarah stood on the porch for several minutes, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She knocked on the door, called out, pleaded to be allowed to see her daughter. But the house remained silent, as if it had swallowed her voice entirely. It was as she turned to leave that she heard it faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakably real. From somewhere high above, from what must have been the attic of the house, came a sound that made her blood freeze. A child's voice, weak and pleading. Asterisk, Mama, help us. Asterisk, Sarah looked up at the attic windows, but they were too high and too dark to see into. She called out, but there was no response. The sound did not come again. By the time she reached her horse, Sarah Hutchins was shaking so violently she could barely mount. But she was no longer just a grieving mother looking for her lost child. She was a woman who had glimpsed something monstrous, something that violated every natural law of decency and humanity, and she was going to find a way to expose it. Sarah Hutchins returned to town that evening with a story that would have seemed like the ravings of a madwoman, were it not for the fact that she had physical evidence to support her claims. Before leaving the Callahan property, she had circled the house, looking for any other signs of the children she was certain were being held there. What she found would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Behind the house, near what appeared to be a root cellar, she discovered a pile of children's clothing, dirty, torn, and stained with substances she didn't want to identify. These garments told a story of neglect and abuse that made her stomach turn. Among them, she recognized a small blue dress with tiny pearl buttons, a dress she had sewn herself for Mary's 8th birthday. Sarah gathered as much of the clothing as she could carry and brought it back to town as evidence. When she showed it to other families, the recognition was immediate and devastating. Mrs. Morrison identified a small boy's shirt that had belonged to one of her twins. Harold Foster recognized his son's favorite suspenders. The Webb family found a hair ribbon they had given to their youngest daughter. The implications were staggering. Either these children had been stripped of their possessions and abandoned somewhere, or something far worse had happened to them. But Sarah wasn't finished. Over the next several weeks, she began conducting what could only be described as a criminal investigation. She questioned everyone who had ever had contact with the Callahans, documented every story, every inconsistency, every strange detail. What emerged was a pattern of deception and manipulation that went far beyond simple child abandonment. Mrs. Dorothy Hensley, who ran the general store, revealed that the Callahans had been purchasing supplies in quantities that didn't match the number of people they claimed to be feeding. For a household supposedly caring for nearly 40 children, they bought remarkably little food. Their purchases consisted mainly of rope, nails, wooden planks, and large quantities of lye, the same substance used to break down organic matter. Thomas Creek, a local carpenter, came forward with information about work he had done for the Callahans. In the summer of 1850, Ezekiel had hired him to install what he called sleeping quarters in the attic of the farmhouse. But the specifications were bizarre 39 small wooden enclosures, each barely large enough for a child to lie down, with heavy wooden doors that locked from the outside. Asterisk, it was queer work, Creek told Sarah. When I asked what these compartments were for, Brother Ezekiel said they were prayer closets, places where the children could go for solitary communion with the Lord. But they looked more like, they looked more like cages. Asterisk, the carpenter also revealed something else that chilled Sarah to the bone. Ezekiel had been very specific about the construction. Each enclosure needed to be soundproof, with thick wooden walls and heavy doors. When Creek had questioned the necessity of such features for prayer closets, Ezekiel had quoted scripture. Asterisk, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret. Asterisk, but perhaps the most disturbing testimony came from Dr. Ephraim Caldwell, the county's only physician. In late 1851, Ezekiel Callahan had approached him with questions about anatomy, specifically about how long it would take for a body to decompose under various conditions. He claimed to be preparing a sermon about the resurrection of the flesh and wanted to understand the natural process of death and decay. Dr. Caldwell had found the questions odd, but not necessarily suspicious. At the time, many preachers delved into such topics for theological purposes, but in retrospect, the specific nature of Ezekiel's inquiries seemed ominous. He had been particularly interested in the effects of lime and lye on organic matter, and whether certain methods could accelerate decomposition. As Sarah compiled this information, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The Callahans weren't running an orphanage or a religious school. They were operating something far more sinister, a systematic operation designed to make children disappear. But the most chilling evidence came from an unexpected source. Children themselves. In December of 1852, Sarah Hutchins made a discovery that would finally give her the leverage she needed to involve the authorities. She learned that not all of the children taken by the Callahans had vanished without a trace. Rebecca Owens, a 12-year-old girl from a neighboring county, had escaped from the Callahan farm 6 months earlier. She had been found wandering the mountain roads in a state of near starvation, speaking in whispers and flinching at any sudden movement. Her family had taken her home and tried to help her recover, but Rebecca had been too traumatized to speak coherently about her experiences. It took Sarah several visits to gain Rebecca's trust. And even then, the girl's testimony came in fragments, broken pieces of memory that had to be carefully assembled into a coherent narrative. Asterisk, they kept us in the wooden boxes. Asterisk, Rebecca whispered, her hands trembling as she spoke. Asterisk, during the day, we had to stay in the boxes. They were so small. I couldn't stand up. I couldn't stretch out. Sometimes for days and days. Asterisk, Sarah gently encouraged the girl to continue, her heart breaking with every word. Asterisk, Brother Ezekiel said we were learning to be closer to God. He said the boxes were like Jesus' tomb, and we had to stay in them until we were ready to be reborn. But it wasn't like that. It was ... It was punishment. Asterisk, Rebecca described a daily routine. It was systematically designed to break the children's spirits. They were awakened before dawn and forced to recite religious passages for hours. Any mistake, any sign of weakness or defiance, resulted in immediate confinement to the wooden cages in the attic. The girl's description of the attic matched Thomas Creek's construction exactly. 30-9 wooden enclosures, each barely large. Enough for a child, arranged in rows like cells in a prison. The children were locked inside for infractions both real and imagined, speaking without permission, failing to memorize scripture, showing any emotion other than pious submission. Asterisk, some of the little ones cried. Asterisk, Rebecca continued, her voice growing smaller. Asterisk, double quotes, Mrs. Temperance didn't like crying. She said it showed we were truly surrendering to God's will. The ones who cried, they stayed in the boxes longer. Asterisk, but it wasn't just punishment that the cages were used for. Rebecca described a more systematic process, a deliberate attempt to break down the children's individual identities and remake them into something else entirely. Asterisk, Brother Ezekiel said we had to forget our old names, our old families. He said, those were attachments to the sinful world, and we couldn't serve God properly until we let them go. He would put us in the boxes and tell us to pray until we couldn't remember who we used to be. Asterisk, the process was gradually escalated for children who showed resistance. First, they would be confined for a few hours, then overnight, then for days at a time, with minimal food and water, passed through slots in the wooden doors. Asterisk, the ones who fought it the most. They started disappearing. Asterisk, Rebecca said, her voice barely audible. Asterisk, Brother Ezekiel said they had been chosen for special service, that they were going to be with God, but we never saw them again. Sarah asked the question that had been haunting her for months. Rebecca, how many children were there when you left? Asterisk, the girl's answer confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Asterisk, 39. There were 39 of us in the boxes. Asterisk, but Rebecca had more to tell, details that would finally give Sarah the evidence she needed to involve law enforcement. Asterisk, I got out because of the smell. Asterisk, Rebecca said, her words coming faster now, as if she needed to get them out before she lost her courage. Asterisk, there was a smell coming from underneath the house, sweet and sick, like when animals die in the woods and you find them later. Mrs. Temperance was always burning things in the cellar clothes and other things. She would make us carry bundles down there, but we weren't allowed to look inside. Asterisk, the girl described being forced to help with what Temperance called cleaning duties, carrying mysterious bundles from the attic to the cellar, washing blood-stained clothing, and spreading lime around the foundation of the house. Asterisk, one night, I saw her burning a little boy's shoes. Asterisk, Rebecca whispered. Asterisk, they were Tommy Morrison's shoes. I recognized them because his mama had made them. Special for his small feet. But Tommy wasn't there anymore. Brother Ezekiel said he had gone to serve God, but his shoes were being burned like trash. Asterisk, this was the detail that finally broke through Rebecca's traumatized silence and allowed her to speak the truth that Sarah had suspected but been afraid to voice. Asterisk, they weren't sending us away to other families. Asterisk, Rebecca said, tears streaming down her face. Asterisk, they were killing us. One by one, they were killing us and burning what was left. Asterisk, Rebecca had escaped during a November night when Temperance had forgotten to properly secure her cage door. Half-starved and traumatized, she had climbed down from the attic, crept past the sleeping adults, and fled into the mountain wilderness. She had survived for 3 days eating berries and drinking from streams before being found by travelers. On the logging road, asterisk, I keep having dreams about the others. Rebecca told Sarah about the ones still in the boxes. They're calling for help, but no one can hear them because the boxes are so thick. What if they're still up there? What if some of them are still alive? Asterisk, it was this possibility that children might still be alive and suffering in the Callahan attic that finally convinced Sarah to take her evidence to the authorities. In January of 1853, she rode to the county seat and presented her findings to Sheriff William Hardin. The sheriff, a practical man with little patience for mountain superstitions, was initially skeptical. But when Sarah showed him the physical evidence, the clothing, Rebecca's testimony, the documentation of impossible placement stories, he realized he was looking at something that demanded official investigation. The wheels of justice, such as they were in 1853 Kentucky, began to turn. Sheriff William Hardin assembled his posse on the morning of November 17, 1853. In addition to his 2 deputies, Thomas Whitmore and James Clark, he brought along Dr. Ephraim Caldwell, Thomas Creek the carpenter, and 3 other armed men from town. Sarah Hutchins begged to be allowed to accompany them, but Hardin refused, telling her that what they might find was no sight for a woman to witness. How wrong he was. What they found was no sight for anyone to witness. The ride up Bent Mountain took on the quality of a funeral procession. The November morning was bitter cold, with a thin layer of frost covering everything in sight. As they climbed higher, Deputy Whitmore later recalled, the very air seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, as if the mountain itself was trying to warn them away. When the Callahan farmhouse came into view, the first thing they noticed was the smoke rising from behind the building. Someone was burning something in the backyard, and the smoke carried a smell that made several of the men cover their noses with handkerchiefs. Sheriff Hardin called out as they approached the house, asterisk, Ezekiel Callahan. This is Sheriff Hardin. We need to speak with you about some missing children. Asterisk, the response was immediate and telling. Instead of coming to the door, Ezekiel Callahan appeared around the side of the house, emerging from the area where the smoke was rising. His clothes were stained with ash and something else, something dark that looked suspiciously like blood. His eyes, always unsettling, now held a wild quality that made the armed men instinctively reach for their weapons. Asterisk, you have no business here. Sheriff, asterisk, Ezekiel said, his voice carrying none of its usual preacher's cadence. Asterisk, this is God's work you're interfering with. Asterisk, asterisk, where are the children, Ezekiel? Hardin demanded. Asterisk, we have testimony that you've been holding nearly 40 children on this property. We need to see them, and we need to see them now. Asterisk, Ezekiel's laugh was a sound that would haunt the men for the rest of their lives. High, sharp, and utterly without warmth. Asterisk, children? There are no children here, Sheriff. There never were any children here. Asterisk, but even as he spoke, one of the Men Deputy Clark pointed toward the attic windows of the house. "Sheriff," he said quietly. Asterisk, look at the windows. Asterisk, every man in the posse turned to look, and what they saw made their blood run cold. In the attic windows, barely visible, but unmistakably there, were faces. Pale, thin faces pressed against the glass, children's faces, watching the scene below with expressions of desperate hope. Asterisk, Ezekiel Callahan, Sheriff Hardin said, his voice carrying the full authority of the law. "You are under arrest for the unlawful imprisonment of minors. Men, search this house. Find those children." Asterisk, what followed was chaos. Ezekiel tried to run, but Deputy Whitmore tackled him to the ground. Temperance appeared from inside the house, screaming in that odd, inhuman voice, trying to bar the door against the men. Dr. Caldwell and Thomas Creek forced their way past her and into the house, following the sound of crying that was now clearly audible from the upper floors. It was Deputy Whitmore who reached the attic first. The narrow stairs creaked ominously under his weight, and with each step the smell grew stronger, that sweet, sick odor of decay mixed with human waste and something else, something that spoke of prolonged suffering. When he pushed open the attic door, his lantern illuminated a scene that would be seared into his memory forever. 39 wooden cages lined the walls of the attic, exactly as Thomas Creek had built them 3 years earlier. Each one was barely large enough for a child to curl up inside, with thick wooden walls and heavy doors that locked from the young. Outside, 20-3 of the cages were occupied. The children inside were in various states of physical and mental deterioration. Some were unconscious, others were whimpering softly, and a few stared out through the wooden slats with eyes that held no recognition. No hope, no humanity left in them at all. Deputy Whitmore would later testify that the smell inside the attic was so overwhelming that he had to step back outside twice to keep from vomiting. The floors were covered with human waste, rotting food, and stains that could only be blood. The children themselves were emaciated, covered in sores, and showed clear signs of prolonged abuse and neglect. "My God," Dr. Caldwell whispered when he reached the attic. Asterisk, how long have they been like this? Asterisk, some of the children were responsive enough to answer. A little girl who identified herself as Susan Webb, one of the children reported missing 2 years earlier, whispered that they had been in the cages for asterisk. "So long I forgot what the sun looks like." Asterisk, but it was the empty cages that told the most horrifying story.